All right. In an unprecedented act of graciousness this morning, BJ has given us plenty of time, and I'm glad that he did because he kind of stuck me with the whole chapter of Ezra 7 this morning. And we're gonna bulldoze through a few things at the beginning, just because there's a lot that happens between 6 and 7, and then we'll dive in, and we finally get to actually be introduced to the guy the book is named for today. So I look forward to jumping into that study with you all. But before we jump into that, Michael Couch, would you lead us in a prayer before we begin?
Let's all pray. Heavenly Father, we're so thankful this morning for the great service we had here this morning, the words that you heard, the songs that you're saying. Pray that everything is God in a manner that pleases you. We want you to ask that you be with us now as we open your word in this hour of Bible study. Philip, yes, we give him a great remembrance of all of the study, and the listeners, listen with open hearts and open minds. Help us to absorb and consume your word as being taught to us. We ask you to go with us now for this study. And we thank you for your son. In his name we pray.
Amen. Thank you, Michael. So we will be getting into chapter 7 today. Ironically, I started... Oh, excuse me. I'm not going to be able to punch this button if I don't click the right thing. Thank you. But I can't read all of my notes are on the slides. Ironically, I titled the title slide of this lesson, and finally we get to Ezra, and then I proceeded to dump a ton of slides between this slide and the first slide where we actually start reading Ezra 7, because there's a lot of stuff that happens in between Ezra 6 and 7 that we don't get from the text, and it's a theme that I wasn't expecting to happen over and over again with Ezra when me and BJ picked this out. But there's a lot of stuff that is interconnected in the book of Ezra with all of these other books, whether that's the prophets, whether that's other histories that are happening. And so up until chapter 7, we've been basically getting the prologue, right? This is sort of all of the stuff that Ezra is filling the reader in with to explain what and why the things that are going to happen when he arrives on the scene have happened. He's setting the stage for us, and he does that for a giant chunk of the book, keeping us caught up with what's going on in the promised land, what's going on in the world around him, the building of the temple, and all of the things that come with that. We've seen the rise and fall of kings in Persia, the rise and fall of the Jews' courage and of their faith. You know, we have these sort of cycles that they're going through with years spanning in between them. And the cyclical nature of the return bringing up recurring themes, it's mirroring the nature of man, drifting from God's purpose and continually building on him as the foundation for identity. We see that they get all jazzed up and they start doing something, and then they get scared or something happens and their faith wavers, and so they stagnate for a little while. And then they have to get a sort of a kick in the pants again, and then the cycle starts back over, and they get all jazzed up and they move on to the next phase. And it's a relatable theme because this is what happens in our own life, isn't it? I know when I was a young Christian, when I was a kid, I'd go to camp for a week and I'd be all jazzed up. And then by the end of the summer, I was, back to not really wanting to go to church on Wednesday nights when I was young. And that doesn't stop when you're young. It continues when you're older. We have these moments where we're really zealous for the word, and then something happens in our life, like BJ was talking to us this morning. And it's not necessarily about... It's about the endurance that we have to get through those times and to keep that cycle from repeating itself. And that's what Ezra so far has been sort of showing us in this prologue. And so now we're introduced to the main character and another key player in the story of the restoration. So the context of getting into chapter 7, the temple is completed in chapter 6, and it's completed in 516 BC. But Ezra 7 opens up in 458 BC. And so there's a span of about 58 years from the time that the temple is dedicated and they have all of this stuff going on to the time that Ezra actually shows up on the scene. And there's an entire generation that has come of age and lived and died between Ezra 6 and 7. There are children born the year that the temple is dedicated, and now they're grandparents by this point. So there's a big gap in between these two things happening, and a lot of stuff is happening. The men who wept the foundation of Lane in Ezra 3 that we talked about a few weeks ago, they're long dead. This is we're going with an entirely new generation of people, and what comes with a new generation of people, a new generation of problems to solve, because just the span of time that happens allows for things to sort of fall off the rails. But the thing is that the world doesn't stand still for 58 years, right? I mean, there's quite a few of us, I would imagine, in this room that are under the age of 58. And those of us who are over the age of 58 in this room know that it goes by like that, but things are happening. It's not like things have stayed the same since, you were 1 year old. A lot of time has happened. And so when we left off, basically Darius had instructed the Israelites that he basically wrote this big letter. We talked about all the things that he incorporates in that letter. And he gives them the opportunity and the resources to complete the temple. And so it's completed in 516, and that's the 6th year of Darius's reign, so relatively early in his reign. He continues to reign for another 30 years, and he dies at around the age of 64. And there's a war that he fights with the Greeks. And he's humiliated at this famous battle called the Battle of Marathon by a vastly inferior number of Athenian warriors. And so he goes out there, and then that sort of becomes his main mission. He is so humiliated by this that becomes his sole purpose, is trying to get back and conquer Greece. And then because Greece is able to whip the Persians, Egypt starts getting some big ideas, and they're like, you know what? We don't really like the Persians. We're going to revolt. And so then he builds the largest army that the Persians had ever fielded and goes down to Egypt and tries to take care of this Egyptian problem while also fighting a war with the Greeks. And there's so many things going on towards the end of his reign that there's chaos all over that western frontier. Right, we got Greece up here, and then we got Egypt here, and who's right in the middle? The Jews. And so he's dealing with all of this, and his health starts to decline, and he basically, even though he is aged, he decides to go out and field on the battle, and he never gets to actually see his vengeance on the Greek or put down the Egyptian rebellion. He spends about a month being sick, and then before he can go from Egypt to Greece, he winds up dying at about 64 years old. And so the king who had basically built all of this for the Jews is now passed. The guy who was giving them the blank check is no longer in the picture, not too long after the temple is finished. And so his son comes to power. And we don't read about his son in the book of Ezra, but he is very important for Scripture. And it's very important to understand who he was so we understand what's happening when Artaxerxes I comes on the scene. And so I'm just going to kind of blitz through this because we're not studying Esther in this class, but his son is the king who becomes king of Persia that we read about in Esther. Xerxes I becomes king. He picks up where his dad left off, and so he goes in 484 and he crushes the Egyptians. He brutally brings them back into submission. And he is so victorious that when he comes back, he throws a huge banquet after a couple of years on the campaign trail. He throws this giant banquet, and while he throws this giant banquet, he gets super duper drunk, and then he demands that his queen come down and show off in front of a room full of nobles who have been on a 7-day bender. And we all know how that story ends. The queen refuses, and then after she refuses, he decides, I need to find another queen. And that's where we get Esther on the stage. So between chapters 6 and 7, this is where the entire book of Esther slides in, and we see all of the stuff that happens there. Right after he marries Esther, this is when his oldest son Darius is born. And then several years later, he decides, you know what? My dad never did whip the Greeks, and I think I owe it to him to go whip the Greeks. So he builds an even bigger army. And he marches off, leaves Esther and all of the goings on in Susa, and goes to Greece. And then he has this little tiff at a place called Thermopylae. And he happens to lose a pretty major battle to 300 Spartans that are led by the legendary Leonidas at a place called Thermopylae in 480 BC. And after this, he's really sore about it. He has a couple of more big battles and they still fail. He never gets all the way over to Greece. And so he comes home frustrated and humiliated. And he's in a state where suddenly, and when he comes back, he has another son that's born. And when he gets back, he's in this different mindset than he was earlier in his career. And he listens to an Agagite noble, and he nearly wipes the Jews in Persia and in surrounding territories off the map. And so Esther, we know the story, saves her people, including the ones living currently in Judah, because this was an edict that went nationwide. So this affects the people who were there in the Promised Land with the new temple. It wasn't just a problem for the Jews who were left in Persia. This was everyone was going to have to deal with this. And she rises to the occasion for such a time as this, as the book says, and winds up saving the Jewish people. And his sons, Xerxes' sons, would have been young boys when all of this is happening. They would have been witness. They might not have known them personally, but they would have been witness to characters like Mordecai, like Esther. They would have known Jews that were integrated into the Persian court, because we've seen from Daniel through Esther and talking today about Ezra, the Jewish scribal class is heavily integrated into the Persian hierarchy and into their court. But then in 465 BC, Xerxes is assassinated in his own bedchamber by his bodyguard and a commander, Artabanus, with the help of Aspermides, who was a eunuch at the time. And they basically sneak into the king's bedchamber and kill him and then sneak back out. And then depending on which source you read, basically, they go to the second oldest son. They go to this guy named Artaxerxes. They skip Darius, and they go to Artaxerxes, and they convince him that his older brother Darius has butchered his father in his sleep. And so Artaxerxes believes in these trusted counselors, and he kills his own older brother as vengeance for this patricide. And the crown prince is killed, and Artaxerxes becomes the heir. And only after he becomes king does he uncover the truth behind this plot. He finds one of the co-conspirators, a guy named Megabezus, and that guy, to save his own skin, sells out all of the other conspirators, and so he has the killers executed. But can you imagine the headspace of a king who kills his own brother because his father is brutally murdered, only to find out that his brother was completely innocent, and it was in fact the people manipulating him that were in places of power that had caused all this to happen. And now you have not only killed your brother, but you have failed to avenge your father. And now you are a young man thrust into the throne with all of this kind of trauma and guilt racking you. And this is the world that Artaxerxes is born into, a place of intrigue and chaos. And he's a younger son that's thrust onto the throne by a catastrophic court conspiracy. He comes to power through trauma. He survives it through personal courage. And then you have to govern the largest empire on earth. And so after this awful ascension, he is recorded by historians, notably the Greeks, who are their sworn enemies, as being one of the most mild-natured and benevolent of all of the Persian kings. And the Greeks sing his praises in their histories. Even an enemy of theirs, his reign is marked by relatively little chaos. He is a peaceful person. He's a mild-natured person. And I can only imagine, after going through the things that he goes through, why he would be that person of that temperament. And I doubled my slides. But he's born into a court where Jewish people were plotted against and almost wiped out. He could have known Esther and Mordecai personally when he was a young boy. We don't know that for sure, but he would have been in the right place at the right time. And he at least would have remembered their stories as part of his childhood. And he comes to power and spends the first 10 years suppressing another brother who contests the throne, and then 6 years suppressing the revolt in Egypt. And eventually he quells the revolt in Egypt, and he comes back and he wants to make peace. So in his 7th year, he returns from the long wars and begins this reign of sort of a benign peace. And he's seeking to establish stability in civil and religious governance. A scribe of the Jewish people petitions him to return to a little backwater province on the western frontier where he's just fought for 6 years. And he grants him everything he asks for. And that's where we get introduced to Ezra, in Ezra chapter 7. Would somebody please read for us Ezra 7, 1 through 6?
After these
events during the reign of King Artaxerxes of Persia, Ezra, Sariah's son, Azariah's son, Hilkiah's son, Shallum's son, Zadok's son, Ahitub's son, Amariah's son, Azariah's son, Mariot's son, Zerahai's son, Azai's son, Bukai's son, Abishua's son, Phinehas's son, Eleazar's son, the chief priest Aaron's son, came up from Babylon, and he was a scribe skilled in the law of Moses, which the Lord, the God of Israel, had given. And the king granted him everything he requested, because the hand of the Lord his God was on him.
Thank you, BJ. I am not going to pick on BJ because I think anybody in this room, including myself, would have read that passage with the exact same cadence and tone as BJ just did. Because the first 6 verses is just a list of people that Ezra is related to. And I have this thought question because it's going to also be pertinent in several other chapters that we're going to read. Why are these names in his genealogy recorded in chapter 7? What makes this, I think a lot of times when we think about some of these books in the Old Testament where there's lots of genealogies and names, that is effectively the most boring read in the Bible, right? To us in the 21st century. But why are they there? Why is it so important that Ezra's lineage is preserved for us in these first 6 verses? Carrie?
It establishes that Ezra is in the direct lineage of Aaron, the first high priest, and the fact that he's a scribe and well versed in history and the histories of the Israelite people. He's in a great position to help launch the reset of the religious part after the temple was built.
Okay, so there's a degree, there's an amount of pedigree, right? There's a pedigree, and it would be sort of like hanging on your wall. You've got a doctorate degree. Somebody looks at that, they can tell that okay, he went to this school. He's versed in these things, and so there is sort of an amount of I'm not sure what the word I'm looking for is, but he has the credentials to be able to do the task that is set before him. So there is that amount. Okay, what else? What are some other reasons, maybe not just with Ezra, but like in general, why is it important that we have these names recorded other than just a pedigree? Isaac?
It kind of helps us to, establish a little bit of a timeline, because you could look and be like, okay, so this happened, this guy lived during this time. It also, it helps to show that the Bible is a historical document. Like it has been around for a long time, and it's a historical document. I think it adds truth to it, and it's a good way to see and like, oh, these were real people. This was recorded. This isn't made up.
Right. Okay. So it establishes its own authority in the text. It helps you keep track of, it seems like a mundane thing, but if you can establish that this person was the son of this person, we do use genealogies to count back timeline wise in a lot of these Old Testament passages. Interestingly enough, this actually is not a complete genealogy, and we'll get into that in a little bit because it skips a lot of big gaps. The names that are picked here are specifically picked, and there's some reasoning behind that. But any other thoughts on that before Randy, and then BJ?
I think it helps us to understand the importance of worshiping God, doing the right things in the right ways. When the Jews were in Babylon, they didn't have a temple to worship. They had to wing it due to circumstances. But now that they're back in Jerusalem, it was important, and the right way was that you had certain people doing certain things in the worship, around the temple and so forth. And so, even though it may be very difficult for us to do the right things, God expects that. And I think it kind of teaches us here too, to show us that there is a connection of the right things of old. You can still do those the right things that new.
Perfect. And I've got some, that's a perfect answer to segue into my point, but BJ, did you have your hand? Okay. So we're introduced to Ezra the scribe. He's the son of Sariah, and then we go through this whole list of names, and eventually it brings us back to the son of Aaron, the chief priest. His lineage is actually the same one that's mentioned in 1 Chronicles 6, 3 through 15, but it does skip a few generations in chapter 7's version, which is not an inconsistency. That's not because the Bible is full of errors and somebody didn't think to write it down. No, these names are picked in a way that a lot of Hebrew genealogies are, where they can skip some generations and they're hitting the highlight reel of the people who came before you. And the reason that these people are picked is because to us, we might forget some of the names that are in this list because we're 21st century Christians and we remember the big guys. We remember Aaron. You know, we'll go through this list of names and we might recognize one or two of them, but then we get, oh yeah, Aaron, he was the original high priest. And that's kind of our world's version of it. But somebody who is in a Jewish perspective in Ezra's day is going to hear these names and hear a lot more than maybe what we remember because they're more closely related to it and they're steeply inundated in it. We have Eleazar, Aaron's successor. This is the son of Aaron. And in that name, the Jews would recognize there is a history of obedience. Because Aaron, this is the third son of Aaron after his older brothers offered the wrong fire in the tabernacle in Numbers chapter 20. And so they're calling back, you know, when a person is reading this name, oh, yeah, Eleazar. That is the inheritor of Aaron because he was obedient when his brothers were not. We have Phinehas, a history of protecting the covenant. He drove a spear through a man who brought a Midianite woman into the tent and set off a camp-wide plague in Numbers chapter 25. You remember the story where nobody else was standing up to him. He takes this Midianite woman, he's showing her off, and he's basically flaunting it in the face of the leaders and in the face of God. He goes into his tent, and Phinehas grabs a spear and just impales him so hard that it goes through him and kills her as well, because he cannot stomach this display of brazen intolerance for the word of God. Zadok, a history of faithfulness. He remained loyal to God's anointed David when Absalom revolted, and he is eventually made high priest, and he's the one who anoints Solomon because he stays loyal to God's anointed. There's a history of faithfulness in 2 Samuel and 1 Kings. And then in Ezekiel 44 promises that in the restored order, this period that we're talking about now, the Zadokite priests will be the ones who approach God to minister before him because they remained faithful when Israel went astray. And Hilkiah, a history of searching for truth. He is the one who finds the book of the law when Josiah is in the middle of his reforms in 2 Kings 22, verse 8. Seraiah, a history of hopelessness. This is the last priest of Solomon's temple. He's executed by Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah. We talked about this at the beginning of the class, just after Jerusalem's fall. These names are selected not as a complete genealogy. It's a highlight reel. It's Ezra's family story is the story of the spiritual journey of God's people since the Exodus.
I think you made an important point. While this might be boring to us, we're not the only audience. And so when you think about the audience back then, as they understand these things, and like you said, they see these names that they might recognize, whereas maybe we gloss over them until we get to Aaron. We never know what impact that had on that audience. There could have been people who were lukewarm when this was read, when this was studied, when whatever. Those people might have been swayed to God's side, so to speak, when they piece this together. And when they hear those names that they recognize, that we might in tune, like you've already said, gloss over a little bit. So I think we have to keep in mind, and we do a disservice when we kind of only focus on how boring it is to us, because we are not the only audience for sure.
And that's the point. There is so much detail in here that if we just sort of skim through it, we miss the deeper connections that the Bible is trying to make for us in some cases. And it is a different audience, and we need to be aware of that when we're reading and not just gloss over it. BJ?
Take back off Damon's, comment. That's exactly what happens in Hebrews 11 and 12 for us. Considering this great cloud of witnesses and all these names and their lives and what they did, it moves us and motivates us as Christians. While that list of names might mean nothing to someone who knows nothing about the Bible, to us it's significant, and we recognize the way it's supposed to move us to action, and that's the whole point behind why the Hebrew writer does what he does in Hebrews 11.
Sandra?
I think another thing that we need to keep in mind is it points out the importance of teaching the young, the next generation.
It does, because the reason that these names are important is because they're supposed to have meaning to these people, right? And he wouldn't bring them up if they meant nothing to them. And what we'll see as we jump into this a little bit further is that when you even though it's just a couple of verses, when you look at what it's actually saying, it shows that there is a culture of continuance. There is a culture of people who are being taught these things even in captivity. I think a lot of times, sometimes we assume they're being punished and then they go off and we get the highlight reel from a couple of guys, like Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. But there's a much broader movement of preservation that has to happen. Otherwise, the things that Ezra is trying to do are not possible. There is this teaching of the older and the younger, and we talked about that a couple of weeks, that is continuing on. Mark, did I see you had your hand up? Okay. Any other thoughts on that? Okay. So Ezra while he is recording a pedigree to let the reader know not who his grandparents were, or just to connect himself back to Aaron or for street cred, he's shining a light on the history of the people as a whole, on his family's role in the worship of the Most High, and connecting the thread of generations to the stories of past work, to the things that he is about to have to go and do. And so who is this guy? He says that he is a scribe. He is skilled in the law of Moses. What is a scribe? What is his job? What do we know about Ezra from his job description? If you were to go on LinkedIn, for those of you who are in that professional world, and you go to somebody's profile to see where they've worked and what they've done, and they have their job description listed there, what can you usually intuit by the thing that they put on there, the thing that they consider most important to slap on a resume? What is Ezra's role as a scribe? Sort of like BJ. Okay, he talks too long and no, yeah, okay. He is someone who is charged with studying the scriptures, with laying out the scriptures. Carrie.
Historian, expert in the history of the
Right, he's a historian. He's not only someone who knows the scriptures, he is responsible for keeping those. And what is a scribe's main purpose? Accuracy, because he is doing what? He is writing it down. He is copying it over and over again. And that makes him the person that you go to when you have a question about the text, because no one has seen that text and read that text more times than someone who's had to hand copy it every day for his entire professional life. Brian and then Harold?
They covered it, but they were absolutely meticulous, down to the very jot and tittle of everything they copied, because it had to be accurate. And they did this over and over and over.
Right. You are charged, before printing presses, before spell check, before all these other things that we use today. Your entire purpose is to transcribe the Word of God onto another sheet of paper. And so there is a weight to that responsibility, isn't there? When you are the one who has to write it down. Because what happens if you write it down wrong and then the next guy comes along and copies it? Then it's wrong. And then who knows how many generations it's wrong for, and that old copy, the original, is lost to time. That's why we have to rely, the dedication of these men and the meticulousness of these men is important, because our entire faith hinges on the fact that they did it right, that they copied everything correctly. And I think there's a lot of evidence that we won't get into for that. But he's meticulous. He's a historian. He's learned. He's knowledgeable. Harold, did you have a thought?
You just covered my comment.
Oh, okay. Well, good. One of the things that this tells me, kind of going back to what Sandra was saying, is that even in exile, the priestly class is continuing to preserve and copy the scriptures and train up the next generation and keep the law alive. Even though they've been in Babylon they went to Babylon and now they're in Persia and there's all kinds of chaos, the scriptures are still being kept alive. There is still a job for the scribes to do. And even though the nation was as a whole sinful and was punished for it, there are still those remnants who are keeping that alive even through this period of punishment.
Just a quick side note. I don't think we appreciate how we got by many times. We don't realize the work and the effort that has gone on in the different places and circumstances through which we still have the scriptures preserved today. And that's why it's just so ignorant when people say, the Bible's just written by some guys who got together and just threw some stuff together. It's one of the most ignorant comments people can make in contradiction of scripture, because it was people giving their livelihood in difficult places and difficult times to meticulously write, and that's why we have the scriptures like we have.
Correct. And I think it's a testament to both the men like Ezra and those who came before him that were able to do that in spite of all of this. That alone, the miraculous nature of us having any copies of this at all, just based on the amount of chaos and turmoil that the Bible itself has had to go through to write itself. Is a huge testament to that. And I think we take it for granted because it's so easy for us. We can all read. I think everybody in this room can read. We all have, for the most part, computers, or at least a phone, and maybe if you don't have a computer, you got a typewriter. There's so many things that we have that we take for granted. And that's not the case. And so it is a miracle in and of itself that Ezra and men like him were able to keep this and preserve it for us. Harold?
Yeah, and the time frame, when was the first printing press made? I mean, you're talking about a long history there that had to be copied, and it had to be accurate, and it had to be straight. That in itself it's just a remarkable miracle, but that stayed.
Right. And there's also,
Every copy was identical through all those things.
right. And I think that that's part of the thing that we also don't understand is just the gravity of a scribe and his job. Like the personal responsibility that they have to take. Because if you write something down wrong or you change and alter something, is it on the person who reads that? No, it's on you. And so everybody that goes astray because of something that you did, you are responsible for that. And so there's this heavy gravity of this that he would have been raised up with. And just the through thread through captivity of being able to do all of that and still with all the other stuff that's happening, like just the whole book of Esther. Imagine that there's, a plot that's out there to kill every single one of you and your countrymen, and you're still dedicated to writing the scriptures down and studying them and keeping them on track.
Which should increase our gratitude that we have it so easily accessible to each and every one of us, and that it carries forward as long as it has.
Immeasurably. And I think that's part of why we do it a disservice when we just gloss over names in a list of chronologies. Because those names were preserved for a reason, and it's on us to study deeper and try to understand those reasons. So he's clearly spent enough time in the echelons of power that he's essentially handed a blank check from Artaxerxes, right? I think my clicker died. There we go. His age is not explicitly spelled out in Scripture, but when you dive into it, and we won't necessarily do this for the sake of time, but when you dive into it and work backwards, it's generally accepted that he is probably in his 40s or 50s. There's like a 20-year threshold for margin of error, but he's not a young man. And part of that is because the word that they use to describe him in the Aramaic is mahir, which it requires that somebody is a practiced master of something. It's this idea that he is not a journeyman, he is someone who has perfected this craft, and so there has to have been enough time for him to be a master of this. And so that this particular word invokes typically an older person, but we're not explicitly told. It's generally the consensus that he's in his 40s or 50s. So moving on, verses 7 through 10. Would somebody please read 7 through 10 for us?
Some of the children of Israel, the priests, the Levites, the singers, gatekeepers, and the Nethinim came up to Jerusalem in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. And Ezra came to Jerusalem in the 5th month, which was in the 7th year of the king. On the first day of the 1st month, he began his journey to Babylon. On the first day of the 5th month, he came to Jerusalem, according to the good hand of God upon him. For Ezra had prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord, to do it, and to teach statutes and ordinances in Israel.
Thank you, Mark. So this idea that the good hand of his God rests upon him. It specifically says that he starts this journey on the first day of the 1st month. That's Nisan 1. And his journey begins on the first day of the month that they typically celebrate Exodus. Nisan is when Passover takes place. And it usually, on our timeline, it sort of is March and early April in that area is when he would have left. And so he begins his journey from Persia. We've talked about this journey several times. It's a 900-mile trek, 2 weeks before Passover starts, which means that he is celebrating Passover in his own Exodus, which is sort of poetic in a sense, mirroring the Passovers that are celebrated by his ancestors coming out of Egypt in the Promised Land. And then he arrives in the first day of the 5th month, which is Av 1. He arrives right before Tisha B'Av, which is the day that Solomon's temple was destroyed. The remembrance is not officially recognized as a Jewish holiday until well into the Second Temple period, but we're close enough to that destruction that this would have been on the minds of the people who are living there. And even though we have a new temple that's been around for many years now, it still would have been sort of a time where national consciousness is in mourning, even if it's not necessarily official. And so it takes them 120 days of travel to get from Persia to Jerusalem, which means it's an average of about 7.5 miles, a little more every day, if they didn't stop to observe things like Passover. So it's not necessarily a grueling trip by any stretch of the means. And we learn more about his leaving in chapter 8, but he goes alone with the people, and we'll talk about that in chapter 8. But it says specifically that he was ashamed to ask for soldiers to help him because he had already told the king that he put his total faith and trust in God. And so he would be ashamed to undermine that trust in God by allowing them to go with a band of soldiers. So they're on their own. It's just Ezra and his company and his cohort with no protection except for the good hand of God. And so there's a giant leap of faith that happens there. And then he gets a copy of a letter to Artaxerxes in 11 through 26. This is a copy of the letter that King Artaxerxes gave to Ezra the priest, the scribe, a man learned in matters of the commandments of the Lord and his statutes for Israel. Artaxerxes, king of kings, to Ezra the priest, the scribe of the law of God of heaven, peace. And now I make a decree that any one of the people of Israel or their priests or Levites in my kingdom who freely offers to go to Jerusalem may go with you. For you are sent by the king and his 7 counselors to make inquiries about Judah and Jerusalem according to the law of your God, which is in your hand, and also to carry the silver and gold that the king and his counselors have freely offered to the God of Israel, whose dwelling is in Jerusalem. With all the silver and gold that you shall find in the whole province of Babylonia, and with the free will offerings of the people and the priests vowed willingly for the house of their God that is in Jerusalem. With this money, then, you shall go with all diligence buy bulls, rams, and lambs, and with their grain offerings and their drink offerings you shall offer them on the altar of the house of your God that is in Jerusalem. Whatever seems good to you and your brothers to do with the rest of the silver and gold, you may do, according to the will of your God. The vessels that you have been given for your service of the house of your God, you shall deliver before the God of Jerusalem. And whatever else is required for the house of your God, which it falls to you to provide, you may provide it out of the king's treasury. And I, Artaxerxes the king, make a decree to all the treasurers of the province beyond the river, whatever Ezra the priest, the scribe of the law of God of heaven, requires of you, let it be done with all diligence, up to 100 talents of silver, 100 cores of wheat, 100 baths of wine, 100 baths of oil, and salt without prescribing how much. Whatever is decreed by the God of heaven, let it be done in full for the house of God of heaven, lest his wrath be against the realm of the king and his sons. We also notify you that it shall not be lawful to impose tribute, custom, or toll on any one of the priests, the Levites, the singers, the doorkeepers, the temple servants, and the other servants of the house of God. And you, Ezra, according to the wisdom of your God that is in your hand, appoint magistrates and judges who may judge all the people in the province of beyond the river, all such as know the laws of your God. And those who do not know them you shall teach. Whoever will not obey the law of your God and the law of the king, let judgment be strictly executed on him, whether for death or for banishment, or for confiscation of his goods, or for imprisonment. That's a very long letter that we have copied for us. It's the majority of the chunk of chapter 7 when we're introduced to Ezra. What lessons is God demonstrating in what Artaxerxes is commissioning Ezra to do? Why do we have a legal document lining out all of these things that Ezra is charged with? What are we supposed to glean from this?
Well, it reminds me of other sections of the Bible, for example, the building of the ark. You know, we went and asked the same question about the ark. Why is it so specific? Measurements, the type of wood, and on and on and on. This reminds me of that as well. I mean, specifics are good. Clarity is good. And we certainly have it in this part of Scripture.
Right, the devil's in the details, as it were, right? There's a reason that the details matter, because if you were just writing a generic story, you know, sort of pulling it out of thin air, you wouldn't necessarily have all of these details in it. So it is a testament to there's a reason for it, Brian, and then BJ.
Okay,
there's 3 or 4 times in this chapter we're told God's hand was up on Ezra. And I think that's important. It's something repeated throughout a chapter like that. It's important. And I just want to point out, and in verse 10 is extremely important. It tells us, and I'm reading from the English Standard Version, it said Ezra had his heart set to study, that's the first law of the Lord, to do and to teach the statutes and rules of Israel. So Ezra has had a heart to study, to do, and to teach. That's key. That's important.
Oh yeah, and I think that that's part of why there's so many of these details in this particular letter, because we've been introduced to Ezra, and it says this is the heart that he has stirred up in for him. And then we get the list of things that say, hey, you've got a blank check. The zeal that he has is being fulfilled by the graciousness of Artaxerxes, and now he is able to do all of these things that he has been called to do as well. BJ, do you have your hand? And then Carrie?
It again goes to demonstrate what we spent last class talking about, which we can't fully understand, which is the balance of God's sovereignty and man's free will. God uses the kings and rulers of men to accomplish his will and his tasks. And we see that very clearly here with how Artaxerxes is moved and commissioned, just like, Cyrus, just like Darius. And now, again, God is using these foreign kings to fund, to fuel, to support, and to advance his cause. Though it's their will, it's God's will. And so we can't understand how that all works. It would behoove us to try, but we see that balance of God's sovereignty and man's free will once again.
Right.
God rules over the kingdoms.
And that's a through thread that we are getting pounded with, not in just in Ezra, but also in Daniel. It's this idea of God's sovereignty, of despite these kings being kings of the entire known world at the time, they are fulfilling God's purpose in the choices that they're making. Carrie and then Harold. And then
David said details and clarity are good, but so is authority. And there's already been problems with people in the area trying to stop the work of the wall, for instance, in the temple. So this is a very detailed letter giving Ezra almost unlimited authority and treasure to do what he decides to do.
right, it's explicit in its instructions because it is a legal document. It is a copy of an actual legal clay tablet that they would have had to basically pass out on their way down there and says, hey, just so you're up to date on what we're allowed to do, here is the authority from not only the king, but all of the court as well. Like this is approved by everybody in Susa. And so it's a method of protection and authority that he is given. Harold and then Sandra.
Yeah, again, the same, along the same line, everything he wrote or written in this letter was specific, spelled out, just as the whole word of God is specifically wrote. You would have, you can't understand sometimes how we have all the different denominations and whatever in the world when the Bible is written so specifically and the point. But and that's what it's amazing, the whole book, and it's anybody can understand, how much wheat or how much salt or how much silver that he was talking about when he spelled it out.
Right. And you can see the sort of the nature of Ezra and his personality. He is very clearly a scribe because he is detailed in everything that he's putting. He's putting, how many letters have we read between kings and stuff? He's copying every single thing down so he has the authority and he's doing it meticulously. Sandra, real quick.
One thing that kind of jumps out to me is how similar this letter is to what was given to the original person who led there. And also it shows that God, at least these people understand God exists and that they are on some level beholding to him.
Right. Because he has details, just like the one that was written for Zerubbabel. There are details in this that show that he at least, if not him, the person who's, he sent out to draft this letter, there is a knowledge of them and who they are and what they require for their next offerings. And so we're out of time. I didn't quite get through it, but we'll blame BJ for that because I think I could have. But we will pick this up Wednesday night. There's just a little bit left to cover at the end of Ezra 7. I appreciate everybody's kind comments and your attention this morning. Thank you so much. interesting. I just had to